building healthy church systems. Okay. And building healthy church systems is not away from how God operates. Okay. And so I don't want to go into we have read my profile. And of course, I have a company called Magnicraft Consulting. Magnicraft Consulting is a church consulting firm that helps local churches to grow healthier through empirical assessments, training, revitalization, and strategic blueprints. So we just help churches to make sure that they are healthy, because my philosophy is that if a church is healthy, then a church is going to grow. A church is going to be at their peak. That church, God is going to use that church more for community impact. Okay, so you can go on our website. I've done quite a lot of videos, a lot of blogs on that. Just go on the website. You're going to see quite a lot of information that will help church leaders. Okay, and because of the fact that I did chemical engineering, and God was calling me to start helping churches, so I had to go for training, I had to go for certification, and I'm a continuous learner of different churches across the world. So in my computer, I have quite hundreds of thousands of websites of churches that I study every day, because I love to help churches. I want the pastors and church leaders to have what it takes to do God's work with ease. I will say something in passing, that pastors now are endangered species. When I was young, when I gave my life to Christ, you could see a lot of people going to Bible school. You could see a lot of people going to seminaries, going to school of ministry. But right now, even some children of pastors don't want to even take over their church from their fathers, because they are seeing that the workload of a pastor is actually enormous. I mean, in my church, somebody has financial issues, he runs to the pastor. He has marital issues, he runs to the pastor. He has mental issues, he runs to the pastor. So every problem a sheep has, he runs to the pastor. So I actually developed quite a lot of capacity development to make sure that I can be able to help churches as much as possible. And that has been happening for over 6 years now, in trying to help churches. The way I help churches, I don't just go there to do training. We do proper diagnosis, just like the way you do a SWOT analysis in the business environment. We have a kind of special tool to help diagnose churches so that churches can be able to be healthy. I've written 2 books on church retention. It's on Amazon. Reverend Julius has read the book, forwarded by Dr. Tom Rainer, and then the second one is Busting Church Growth Myth, both on Amazon. Now, one of the things I will say quickly is that right from the Old Testament, God was actually looking for a place to dwell, and it would be unfair for a limited mind to build a place for an unlimited God to dwell. That means that as a human being, we cannot create a space and say, God, come and dwell in this place. So from the beginning until Jesus comes, God will always have a blueprint of how he wants the place he wants to dwell be designed. I need to just establish that foundational truth. God will not live where he wants to stay at the prerogative of a man's limited mind to create a space. He has never done it, and he will never do it. I know most pastors are doing it, trying to do something shabby and expect God to come dwell in that place. The thing is, if God will dwell in any place, it must be in accordance to the design of how God wants it to be. Tabernacle of Moses is an example. Tabernacle of David is an example. Both tabernacles were such that the blueprint, the design, the structures, the dimensions, everything, the blueprint itself was very divine. It was a detailed planning up to the curtains, the dimension of the curtains, the separation of the holies of all from the inner court, and everything was provided from God. I mean, in terms of details. If you look at Exodus chapter 25, verse 7, Bible says, according to all, not some. So most pastors should not build by some, okay? According to all that I show you. He's talking to Moses. That is the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its finishing, just so you shall make it. So it's not something that has to do with, as a pastor, I may do it, I may not do it. It's a shall. It's something that is mandatory for Moses or any church leader to build according to God's pattern. You know, when God wants to do something, he does something in systems, okay? He doesn't create the cattle without creating the grass. He doesn't create the grass without creating the ground. He doesn't create the ground without separating waters from the ground. So God is a system person. God is a design person. When you look at the universe, you'll see that God actually is a system person. God is actually a design person. I'm going to see another statement now. Design will always be in line with purpose. Design will always be in line with purpose. You cannot neglect purpose and expect design to reinforce purpose, okay? You first of all establish what's the purpose of the church, and then we begin to look at the designs and the systems and structures to support or be in alignment with the design that. So in the Tabernacle of Moses, you could see that application that church leaders need to prioritize building according to God's pattern, seeking God's guidance in planning all the details of how the church needs to be planted. The second has to be centrality of worship, because it's a place, tabernacle is a centrality of worship, where in Exodus chapter 25, verse 22, he said that, and there I will meet with you. In that tabernacle, he said, I will meet you. So our churches need to be places where God meets with people. Okay, he said, and there I will meet with you and I will speak with you. So in our churches, pastors should be allowed to create an atmosphere where God comes to be with his people and also speak with his people. In Exodus 25, verse 22. All right. And he said he's going to speak with you from above the mercy seat. I don't want to go into the symbolic nature of the tabernacle, because I want to go into the New Testament church. All right, so that's the design. The application is the place of worship, the place of abode where God will be, must have the essential church life and worship essence of what needs to be done in the church. Then holiness and reverence also is there. I just want to move on away from the tabernacle. But the thing is, the tabernacle was bettered by some skilled craftsmanship. So what it means that if you are to be able to design the church, it must be done by people who are skilled, who are filled with the Spirit of God. In Exodus chapter 31, verse 3-5. You can see the Bible says, because if God gives a blueprint of where he's going to dwell, he's going to give burden to certain persons who will be able to carry the blueprint and implement the blueprint. Okay? So in Exodus chapter 31, verse 3-5, Bible says, he said, and I will fill him with the Spirit of God, because you actually need the Spirit of God to be able to design where God would dwell. So I will fill him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship, because God had to endow Bezalel and Oholiab with special skills, because to build the systems of the church will require the Holy Spirit, will require wisdom, will require great understanding, and will also require the help of God. We need to recognize and utilize the diverse talents and skills in our churches to be able to be spiritual gifts in our churches to be able to give the service to building God's church. Are we together? Can I just get a thumbs up that I'm making some communications across to you before I build up on the next block? Mr. TK, thank you so much for the thumbs up. I just want to be sure that because I'm laying some foundation, we're going to go deeper. So the tabernacle of Moses was not done by the discretion of Moses. The tabernacle of David was not done by the discretion of Moses. And the early church, which I want to use as a descriptive nature for today's church. I'm saying that, and I want you to note that because I want to repeat that quickly. That the descriptive nature of the early church is a prescriptive nature for today's church. So let me give you how God works, okay? I'm a human being. I have a digestive system. Adam and Eve have digestive system. Now, I'm talking about Adam and Eve in the Bible, okay, in the Garden of Eden. God created systems, and systems have to work together. And till Jesus comes, every man will have digestive system. So what I'm saying is that let's look at the systems that the early church had, okay? And then let's begin to align today's churches in alignment with the systems that the early church had. Because if we're going to have the kind of results that the early church had, we must begin to ask ourselves, how was the early church set up? I mean, if you're going to start up a church, can you tarry in a place until you have been endued from on high? Can you tarry in a place where you're going to pray to God so that God will give you the divine blueprint to be able to build according to design so that you can be able to fulfill purpose? Most churches are not set up with the right design, and that's why they cannot be able to fulfill the purpose. In closing, what is the purpose of the church? The purpose of the church is to reach out to the lost and also to mature disciples. That's around the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28 from verse 18 to 20. So this was what the dimension of the tabernacle of Moses. Okay, the outer court has its dimension, which is also a subset of the holy place, a subset of the most holy place, which is as you're going into with God. So you can see that to meet with God does not require large space, because even the most holiest of all, where the high priest gets to, is smaller than where the outer court and the crowd is. I want to move on from here, but then there's so much to glean from here, and we just need to get ourselves past. All right, so what is the church? We have defined the church in a glossing, but see, I want us to just look at the vision framework for a church. A church needs to be very clear what they want to achieve, and that's the first quadrant. As a church consultant, one of the things I want to always say is that there must be balance. If you want to get church health, there has to be balance. Just like a baby. A baby, if you keep giving the baby milk, only milk will never make a baby healthy. Okay, for the baby to be healthy, the baby has to have water, must have exercise, must have fiber, must have sleep, okay, must have the mother's love, and all these things must be balanced. And the balance is a function of a growth mix, because once there's a balance in the growth mix, the baby is going to grow. So what is the balance we're talking about here? The first one is that the church must be crystal clear about what they want to achieve, okay? That's in terms of vision, mission, okay, strategy, goals, objective, job description. One of the things I'll say quickly here is that sometimes some churches, their vision is in contrast with the job description, okay? All the things in the first quadrant must be aligned, okay? Your vision must not contradict your mission. Your mission must be seen in your job description. Your job description must be reinforcing your objectives at a church and things like that. So what is it you want to achieve? Once you are clear about what you want to be, what you want to achieve, then you can begin to go into how you want to achieve it. And how you want to achieve it is now the structure, organization, system, priority, process, and focus. Now, if you look at, I said a statement earlier that the descriptive nature of the early church is the prescriptive nature for today's church. Now, in Acts chapter 2, where we will look at what made the church in terms of systemic setup, all right? And then in Acts chapter 6, those are the two milestones I want to look at, all right? The Acts chapter 2 has to do with the spiritual side of the church, and the Act chapter 6 has to do with the soul side of the church. Just like a man is having a tripartite idea, I'm going to go into that very short. So how do you want to achieve it? And then the third quadrant is we want alike somewhat as a church administrator. When do you know that you have achieved it? Okay, in terms of data. I mean, pastors need to know the kind of data they need to have to be able to lead and manage their church well. What are the key performance indicators that makes you know that the church is faithful to the Great Commission? The scoreboard, dashboard, measures, and things like that. When do you know that you have achieved it? And the last quadrant, which is the culture, and culture has to do with behavior, mannerisms. How do you behave or conduct yourself in order to achieve it? Now, all these things must be balanced. All these things must be balanced. I've seen churches that are very good in the first quadrant, and they are not good in the third quadrant. I've seen churches that they are very good in terms of organization, but their vision statement does not align with the Great Commission. But see, as a church consultant, one of the things I'll say quickly is that there has to be balance. There has to be balance. Everything has to be balanced. You have to have the first healthy and good quadrant, and you have to have the second quadrant also healthy. You have to have the third quadrant also healthy, and the third quadrant also healthy. You can't have a 5-star vision and then have an inferior culture to power that vision. All right, so let's move on from here, and then we'll go into the balance I'm talking about. Now, as a human being, we have the human being is a tripartite being which has a spirit. We're not a spirit, okay, alone. I mean, when I gave my life to Christ many years ago, some Christians keep telling themselves, I'm a spirit, I'm a spirit, I'm a spirit. Imagine someone speaking in tongues for like 3 days. I'm a spirit, I'm a spirit. But you see, the truth about it is that's not the complete truth. You are not a spirit. You are a spirit, yes, but you have a soul and you live in a body. That's the balance and complete truth. And so just like a church, okay, the only church that is spiritual is a universal church. Local churches are not only spiritual, they have the soul dimension and they have the body dimension. And because sure, we're going to understand some of the systems that we're talking about. So every church has a spiritual dimension, a soul dimension, a body dimension. And what I'm trying to say is that for the church to be healthy, for the church to be to have some wellness, every of the platforms, the soul, spirit, and body must be healthy. Every one of them must be healthy. If the spiritual side is healthy and the soul is not healthy, there's no how that the church is going to be healthy. If the soul is healthy, there's no how that and the body is not healthy, there's no how that the church is going to be healthy. What I'm saying is that even when your spirit is healthy, if the other components are not healthy because they are united and working in harmony, there's no how that the entire church is going to be healthy. We're going to look at some of the data points that has to do with the body side. We want to also look at the systems of the soul side. The soul side is actually the organizational side. And the spiritual side has to do with the core, the main core of what the church is setting up for. All right, so let's move on. Can I get another thumbs up that we are together? Don't worry, we're still going to get some questions. That I'm not just... Okay, Mr. TK said, it gave me a thumbs up. I cannot have more persons saying that they're following me so far. And if you have any questions, you might want to just drop that in the comment section so that we'll deal with all the questions immediately. Thank you, Reverend Julius, for the thumbs up. Okay, so let's move on. Now, this is a fishbone diagram. I know some of us are into business, and you must have known the fishbone tool for business. And one of the things I always want to say is that churches need to really not use business tools to assess their church, because the goal of the business is different from the goal of the church, okay? I know most churches like to use SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 forces, all these business tools of assessment, and those assessments are for businesses that are having the end goal of profit. The church is not supposed to be known for profit. The church is meant to be known for souls. And so in my church, if we as we are running up the year, the annual report will not say how much we have made. I mean, how much we have received as a church. We're going to look at how many souls that were saved, how many disciples that were made. And see, one of the things I used to tell pastors is that you are asking God for growth, you are asking God for souls, but do you have what it takes? Do you have the systems to be able to grow the church and mature disciples? In the early church, 3,000 souls were added in one day. It doesn't cost God to add 3,000 souls to a church. But the thing is, if you add 3,000 souls in your church, Do you have the systems to be able to process that 3,000 souls? If you don't have the systems, there's no how God will give you the 3,000 souls, because God would never be in a position to waste souls. Okay, God will never be in a position to waste souls. So this is there's a research to this, and if Mr. TK permits, I might share that research work with you. This is the descriptive nature of the early church. And one of the things I do as a professional, as a church consultant, is to make sure that we activate some of these systems in the church, so that the more these systems are healthy in the church, the more the church approaches health. And when the church approaches health, the church is going to blossom. The church is going to be successful. The church is going to be faithful to the Great Commission as so. So the top side of the fishbone diagram is the spiritual side of the church. Okay, because the spiritual side has to do with God, is organic. It has to do with man and God. And then the bottom side of the fishbone diagram has to do with the organizational health. Okay, organizational side of the church. Okay, so one of the things I would say is that all these 12 systems you're seeing on the screen have to be active. Okay, the descriptive nature of the early church is the prescriptive nature for today's church. So what I'm saying is that the early church was a worshiping church. That's worship system. The early church was a fellowshipping church. That's fellowshipping system. The early church was a discipling church. So discipling system. The early church was a evangelizing church. That's evangelism system. The early church was a serving church. They were serving themselves and serving the community. That's ministry system. The early church was also a praying church, and that's the prayer system. I know that there's a book that was helpful to a lot of churches that in Nigeria that was making impact. I don't want to mention names of churches. I mean, that book really changed a lot of churches in my country. And that book was written by Rick Warren. Rick Warren wrote a fantastic book. I mean, you can writing that kind of book, and was sold in millions. And Rick Warren's book, what's the name now? The Purpose-Driven Church. But you see, the Purpose-Driven Church is a book that you look at the systems that is alignment with the purpose of the church. But in the book, there were 5 systems that were mentioned. It mentioned worship, fellowship, discipleship, evangelism, and ministry. But looking deep into the early church, you could see that there was prayer. If you look at Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47, you will see all this top side of the fishbone diagram: worship, fellowship, discipleship, evangelism, ministry, prayer, all of them all active in the early church. Because if your church needs to get the kind of growth and sustainable growth that the early church had, you must be able to make sure that all these systems are healthy in your church, and you are also getting them to be improved. The thing is this: these systems are there, just like the digestive system has been in me while I was in my mother's womb. The only thing that the digestive system was upgraded. When I was born, I started taking milk, okay? Upgraded, I started taking milk. There's a time that, like, I have a grandmother now. My grandmother cannot take solid what I take, because this digestive system has also changed to some way of getting some smaller breakable nutrients in terms of food. So the descriptive nature of the early church is the prescriptive nature for today's church. And the thing is, as church leaders, we need to study the churches that were mentioned in the Bible. In the Bible, there were over 70 churches that were mentioned, okay? And we need to understand that as you study those churches that were mentioned in the Bible, you could see the prescriptive nature that was described in the early church in the churches that were mentioned in the Bible. So whatever made the early church will make today's church. I must say something in passing, that there's a difference between ministry and church. I don't want to go into that difference today, but let's go into the top side of this is the fishbone diagram, and of the top side is the spiritual side of the church, because it's more organic, it's more spiritual, it's related to God, and it affects the spiritual disciplines of the congregation that is in the church. The bottom side, and then that happened in Acts chapter 2. You see, when you have all these 6 systems taking place in Acts chapter 2, you could see that 3,000 souls were added. You see, let me say something very, very, very important here. As you see Neil Dumadi has all kinds of systems, okay? Nervous system, urinary system, skeletal system, digestive system, reproductive system, respiratory system. You see, the thing is that if there's something wrong with a man's body, that's when you know that a system exists. When somebody has a running stomach, that's when you know that there's a place called stomach. But you see, when all the systems are actually functioning at their peak and they're healthy, you really don't know which system. In fact, every system is just working and you don't know where the systems are actually operating from. And that's how God wants his church to run. Okay, God doesn't like all the blemishes, the spot, the wrinkles, any such thing, because God also wants to marry a bride that is beautiful and glorious without all these things that I mentioned. And from a study of scriptures, I know that there are a lot of prophecy that makes God to come. That means the gospel must be preached in the loops and cranny of the world. But you see, I can tell you that the day the church takes care of the spots, takes care of the wrinkles, takes care of the blemishes, the marriage is going to take place almost immediately, because God actually wants to get married to his bride. And the bride is the body. Paul had to make that analogy, but then there's a deeper ministry to that, which I don't want to go into today, but I just want to also give us some teaser on some of the systems that we can begin to activate. We've done the top side of the video. Now I'm going to look at some of the definitions. And then in Act chapter 2, we could see the top side of the fishbone diagram. And okay, please, if you have questions, please, or comments, you can write them in the chat box. I trust you all be blessed. Please, if you have any comments, you can drop that in the chat box. I'm going to deal with that shortly. Okay, thank you so much. So in Acts chapter 2, you could see that 3,000 souls were added. Chapter 3, 5,000 souls were added because the systems actually work. Systems, the acronym systems, saves you stress, time, energy, and money. That's how God works. All of us, we have systems of how we do things. The only thing is that you are not void of systems. The only thing is that you should be able to audit your systems, to improve your system so that it can deliver to you the purpose of the system. Design your system to ensure that it reinforces and fulfills the purpose for setting up that system. So those 6 systems on the top side, you could see growth, massive growth happening in the early church. But you see, the massive growth came about a lot of challenge in chapter 6. I mean, we need to just, I want to just take some time to just go through this. I know it's recorded and we can all replace some of these things to study deeper. So in Act chapter 6, there was a managerial problem. There was an administrative problem. The Hebrew women started complaining that they were neglected in the daily ministration. That means that in the early church was actually a daily ministration. The early church was actually a daily affair. It's not a Sunday affair. So churches need to have what they do throughout the week, not just waiting for Sunday to do a kind of performance. Most people who visit churches today know that that Sunday is just a performance. Okay, what you do on Mondays to Friday, Saturday will actually tell us what you're going to get done on Sunday. So in chapter 6, the Hebrew women were neglected in daily administration, and then there was a managerial issue. Okay, in as much as the spiritual side, which is the top side of the spiritual diagram, was healthy and they were getting the result, there's another dimension of result that will come to pass in your church when you have the bottom side of the fishbone diagram to be healthy. So in Act chapter 6, you could see that the growth that the church was having was actually born by 12 disciples, 12 apostles actually. And then they had to restructure. They had to get some deacons on board. Okay, that's the structure. They had to have a strategic meeting. That's strategy. I mean, they called all the disciples together, and every one of them started getting their view about what was wrong with the church. You see, your church can be healthy spiritually, and there's still something wrong with your church, okay, in terms of the organization and the setup of the church. So strategy, structure, I mean, the early church was a strategizing church. If you look at Act 6, they called all the disciples together and they talked about the issue that was worrying them in terms of how to share the daily food to everyone. You can imagine the early church, okay, was contradicting true religion because the widows were neglected in the daily ministry. You can imagine Apostle Peter was given his fair share of the daily ministration, and the Grecian women or the Hebrew women were neglected in the daily ministration. You can imagine the grief, the gravity of the offense, because the apostle can just say that, I mean, God has done so much. You can see God is adding to us. I mean, 5,000 souls are added. Miracles are happening. Okay, miracles can be used by the apostles that everything is working. But you see, miracles can happen, but something can still be wrong with how your church is set up. And so the early church was found wanting in terms of true religion. What's true religion? True religion is reaching out to the less privileged, to the hopeless, I mean, helping those who are in need. And so you can imagine a widow perhaps lost her husband 2 weeks ago, came to church for solace, and was neglected in the daily ministration. And so you can see the kind of gravity or contradiction to the true religion that happened. They could have as well shut down the Hebrew women, but no, they activated strategic system. That strategic system, it was calling all the disciples together to deliberate and brainstorm about the issue. Sometimes, most times, the solution to the problems that a church has must not necessarily come from the leadership. In fact, the solution to Moses' problem in Exodus chapter 18 did not come from him or to the people around him. It came from his father-in-law, who was not even born again. So we need to be open in terms of strategy. The early church was a strategizing church. The early church was a structural church, okay, in terms, they brought in deacons, okay. The apostles said that they are not going to neglect prayer and the ministry of the word to serving tables. They had, and someone is in the congregation, let us set up men over this business. And that's how they brought 7 people, 7 deacons to be able to take over that business. And the qualification for being an apostle, because sometimes that's where the imbalance comes to every church. We like to put more emphasis on leadership and downplay on management, okay? 2 planes. A plane cannot fly without 2 wings. A train cannot move from one point to another without 2 tracks or 2 wheels. So the balance every church needs is leadership and management. You cannot be people-oriented all the time and not balanced up with task-oriented activities. And so they got 7 men to be able to take care of the tasks by serving tables in the church. And that's where leaders came to pass. So the bottom side is strategy, structure, leaders, outreach, onboarding. Onboarding is also the same thing as assimilation. And the last one is resources. Resources doesn't necessarily mean only money. It also means all your assets and liabilities as a church, your infrastructure, your ICT as a church. Now, there's a research to this. I don't want to go into that. You see, there's a link between the top side and the bottom side, like worshiping strategy. I can tell you that for your worship service to be healthy, your strategic think tank system must also be top-notch, okay? There's a link between fellowship and structure. You cannot have good self-fellowship or small groups in your church without being clear about responsibilities and accountabilities in your church. There's a link between discipleship and leaders, okay? For your discipleship to be healthy, you must have disciples or leaders in your church. So there's also a link between evangelism and outreach. Evangelism is using the gospel to reach out to the lost. Outreach is using good deeds to reach out to the lost, okay, to the community. So there's a link between evangelism and outreach. There's a link between ministering, the service side of the church, and onboarding. How do you bring in staff, convert, and guests? That's onboarding system, which is also the same thing as assimilation in some churches. There's a link between prayer, because God is our ultimate source, and the resources we have been given by God to administer the church towards health. Can I get another thumbs up again before I go on to the next slide? we have 26 participants in this Zoom meeting, and I've been saying a lot of things, and I hope we're getting some good stuff. Mr. TK, am I good? Am I good?
You are good. You're good. Please go ahead.
All right, because
Thank you.
I like to make my Zoom meeting very interactive. I will take a lot of questions. Now, the thing I want to say before I move away from this slide is that all these systems need to be active. You have to be intentional about their setup, because evangelistic system cannot just be set up by accident. You have to be intentional about all these systems. You have to also make sure that there's a balance to all these systems. You have to also make sure that there's alignment, there's unity, they are working together. I know some of us, and I know I talk to pastors every day. I talk to church leaders every day. Some pastors will tell me that, Pastor Nee, let us concentrate on prayer system. Let us concentrate on prayer. Let us concentrate. You know, that's just what it means when you say, let us concentrate on circulatory system and our body is going to be healthy. But you know that for the human being to be healthy, it goes beyond just making sure the circulatory system is healthy. Every damn system that is in the body has to be healthy. Everything has to be healthy. I mean, if you look at the fishbone diagram very carefully, there's no system that is more pronounced than the other. Every of those systems are very important. They need to be active. They need to be intentional about it, balanced about it. Alignment needs to be there. Then it needs to be from form of connection, unity, and togetherness. I'm going to just close through this slide, but if time permits, maybe if there's another time for us to talk more, because leaders need to have metrics. I mean, metrics that would help your church to know that you're actually going towards health. Okay, like most of the time when I engage church leaders and they tell me our church is 7,000 in attendance, and that doesn't move me, because you can be a tall person and be unhealthy. You can be a short person and be healthy. You can be a fat person and be unhealthy. You can be a slim person. And so size and numbers is not a function that a church is healthy. I mean, pastors usually look at the attendance, how much they get in every Sunday, the space of the auditorium, and some of those things are not the kind of yardstick I use to know when the church is actually healthy. So what are the metrics? I'm not going to mention the definition because there's no time. I need to go into some, and maybe if I don't finish, we can I'm sure by now you've gotten some good information already. So we're going to go through all this. The body side is where we have the vital signs. Let me check up the chat box. Okay, thumbs up. All right, good. So let's go into, so I look at attendance change. Okay, I'm 14 signs. I come to your church and I want to look at because the way I look at data is different. I mean, eye-opening. I've consulted with a lot of churches, and when we look at data in this light, it opens their eyes. You go beyond just the attendance, the how much you make. Okay, I look at your attendance change week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out. Okay, and then we look at the attendance change over the past 10 years. Okay, I look at your guest to attendance rate. Okay, that's your front door abilities. I look at your conversion. I mean, you can imagine some churches have conversion and zero baptism. I look at your conversion and baptism. I look at your young families. How much of your congregation are young families? Because if your church is old and there's no young families in your church, churches do die. It's painful to say it. Churches who don't pay close attention to their church health will end up paying dearly by closing the doors of their church permanently. So young families, how many of those young families are in your church? Next generation, I mean, how many of the millennials, the alpha generations are in your church? Because if your church doesn't have the next generation, there's really no future for your church. And your church needs to leverage on the wisdom of the aged and the strength of the youth. I've seen churches where they have so much youth and no elderly ones, and there's so much strength, and so when that strength is not directed to the purpose of the church, they have a way of making some catastrophic issues in the church. There has to be a balance between the wisdom of the aged and the strength of the youth. We also look at small group participation. How much of your congregation are into small groups? How much of the congregation are volunteering in your church? Most churches should not get into staffing all the time because there's a need for it. How attendance to staff. We also look at per capita giving. Per capita giving is the giving power of the church, the average income of every congregation that visits your church. And you need to look at the per capita giving for over 10 years. You see how your church is increasing in terms of your economic status for your congregation. We also look at wits in cash reserve. Wits in cash reserve is how much you have that your church can survive on without any income from anywhere. I mean, if your church spends 500,000 every month and you have 1.5 million at hand, what it means that your weeks in cash reserve is 12 weeks, 3 months. Okay, your church can leverage on the 1.5 million to survive without any income at all. So we also look at debt to annual giving, percent to staff budget, how much you're spending on your staff, the attendance to seats. If your seat is almost full, it demoralizes psychologically your congregation from inviting people into your church. And the last one has to do with sitting and parking space. Church is beyond just having an auditorium, okay? You need to talk about your Christian space for Christian education, space for children's church, space for foyer, space for parking space for toilet, bathrooms, and space for office, space, and operational issues. And you see, the thing is, your church health is a mirage of all these factors. No one indicator is actually an issue for the church. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that there's a life cycle of the church, and if there's a problem towards the right-hand side of the Bellevue, instead of going to restructuring, can you go back to how the church started? Dream again. Go back to first principles by building again, okay? Dream again. Go to the belief systems and start all over again, because what happens is that what makes the plant to shoot up is actually what is in the ground. And let me take some water. In Nigeria, we have some harmattan, so it's a bit dry. All right, so we go back to the belief system and build up afresh, because if you have all the foundations of the dreaming, building, belief system goals, then it will be easier for you to restructure. And then you're not going to some massive growth as a church. So that's that's the top side of the Fishbone diagram: worship, fellowship, prayer, ministry, evangelism, discipleship, which is the top side of the Fishbone diagram. I have a tool to assess the church, which area is healthy, which area is not healthy, and then we have a way of helping you to move towards health. I can tell you from experience that once you move towards health, you're going to get all kinds of good things. It's not just growth. You're going to, everybody, you just find that things are happening. I mean, everybody loves what is going on in your church. There's harmony, there's unity, there's progress, and things like that. Then the top side is there, and then I told you about, it's organic. The top side is more organic, it's more relational than and it's more spiritual. And one of the things I would say is that it's timeless. Okay, it's timeless. You can see that in Acts chapter 2. It's very clear in Acts chapter 2 in terms of how these systems: worship, fellowship, discipleship, evangelism, ministry, and prayer. And the thing is, if there's one system that is unhealthy, it makes the entire church unhealthy. So there is a spine. The spine is Jesus that holds everything together, not the pastor. Okay, I've seen churches where the pastor is actually the one holding all the systems the church is running. And that's why the church fails to hit the maximum peak that they should get to. The top side is all clear in the, I mentioned about recurrence book, but we added prayer because that also was clear in the early church. So what are the definitions? I'm just go straight to this so that we can have some questions immediately. Worship is attributing the honor and giving the devotion to God that He alone deserves. That's the worship system that the church has. Now, worship system is not the style of music, is not the kind of beats that the church has, is how you value God, how you attribute honor, and you give devotion to God that he alone deserves. Okay. And then what is the breakdown of worship? The breakdown of worship is such that it's more organic, it's in top side of the fishbone diagram, is relational, is timeless. That means that the early church had it, all churches should have it, all times. So if Jesus studies for 3,000 years, there must be a worship system in your church. I could see that in Acts 2 reference, because they had devotion to teaching, they broke bread, there was sense of awe, day by day in the tabernacle, they were praising God, and the complementary component is strategy. The second system has to do with fellowship. The definition is clear. Communion with other believers in order to encourage one another's walk with the Lord. And fellowship was the component in the fishbone diagram. It is organic. It's part of the top side of fishbone diagram. Is relational. It's timeless. All churches have it. The early church had it. Any church today should have it. Future churches to be planted will have it. And it's also referenced in scripture. It's biblical. It's a divine blueprint for God to make sure that they are devoted to fellowship, they're working together, one mind together, and the complementary components to fellowship on the top side of the visual diagram is structure, and that's to do with governance. As I'm sure TK will be happy about that. Your polity governance has a complementary component of the bottom side of the visual diagram. The third system is discipleship. Discipleship is an act of obedience, okay, and that act of obedience must be such that is a fallout from self-denial. You must prefer God to whatever you are doing, all right? And that comes with mentorship, a healthy relationship, training, because spiritual disciplines are taught and they are caught. And so discipleship is where they can catch it and they can teach it. And so what is the details about this? Is that it's more organic, is the top side, is relational, is timeless, all churches have it, all times, and it's referenced in the Bible in terms of the devotion, and of course, the complementary component has to do with leaders, okay? Then the other one is evangelism proclaiming the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ to people, persuade them to become believers, reconciling them to God, and looking at the details of that, it's more organic, is on the top side of the fishbone diagram, is relational, is timeless, all churches should have it at all times, and it's also referenced in the early church because they did a lot of evangelism, and that's why souls were added to them as you see it in the scriptures. Then the complementary component for evangelism is outreach. Then the other one, which is ministry. Ministry is you using your spiritual gifts to serve the body, to serve the community, to edify the body, and to serve the community as a whole. What is the details about this? The framework is that the ministry is organic, it's on the top side of the visual diagram, is relational, is timeless, all churches have it at all times, and now you could see that that they were serving, they serve one another, they were selfless to one another, they had self-denial. And the complementary component of ministry is onboarding. Onboarding also is the same thing as assimilation, your front door and back door ministry. The last one has to do with prayer. Prayer is how you draw near to God and you commune with God. It's a two-way traffic where, and Paul says we should put on the whole armor of God, including prayer. I know Rick Warren didn't put prayer, but prayer is a very, very powerful tool and system that the church needs to have. What is the detail about prayer? Prayer is organic, is on the top side of the visual diagram, is relational, is organic, it relates to God, is spiritual, is timeless, all churches will have it all times. And then you can see it clearly in Acts 2. They devoted to prayer, there was gladness, joy, praising God. And the complementary component to that is resources in the bottom side of the fishbone diagram. So there's a research to that, how the top side of the fishbone diagram relates with the bottom side in terms of relational, people-oriented, and organizational and task-oriented. I need to move on fast. So then the bottom side, which is organizational, okay? The top side is spiritual. The bottom side is organizational. I could see that in Acts 6, where you have strategy, structure, leaders, outreach, onboarding, and resources. These are more administrative, managerial, operational issues at its where. And so they need, and if you look at Acts 6 very well, when they solved the issue of the Hebrew women, Bible says the priest was obedient to the faith. There's a dimension of growth that happens when there's health on the top side of the fishbone diagram and there's health in the bottom side of the fishbone diagram. So look at the sequence now. The sequence of the top side is deliberate. The sequence on the bottom side is also deliberate. Okay, strategy, structure, leaders, outreach. The first three is very, very important because that's what happened in Act chapter 6. They had a strategic meeting, they restructured, and they brought in leaders. That sequence is a fantastic wisdom to be able to kickstart your bottom side of the video. I need to just rush on this. There's so much to share, but I'm sure you can just. So strategy is the first one. It's organizational, all right? And let's look at the breakdown of strategy. Okay, strategy is relational, and then it's on the first of the bottom side of the fishbone diagram, and is how the church needs to sit down and think on how they can be able to fulfill the biblical mission with clarity and doggedity. All right, and then the strategies on the bottom side is task-oriented. You have to meet, there's some form of activity. It's timeless, it's also contextual, because the way you do strategy in Europe will be different from the way you do strategy in Africa. So there's a concept of timeless, and there's a concept of contextuality in that. I could see that also, that it's a complementary component to worship. Then the other one has to do with structure. Structure is how the church needs to set up in terms of fulfilling the mission, how they are aligned with clear-cut responsibility and accountability in terms of relationship, organizational thinking. And then the structure, what is the breakdown, has to do with, is the bottom side of the visual diagram, is task-oriented, all right? It's timeless and also contextual. You could see that in scriptures. And you have to also look at the elder rule in devoted, because they were devoted to the apostles in teaching and leadership. But the complementary component to that is fellowship. Okay, then the other one is leaders. Leaders is of the people who are setting good examples in the church. How do you recruit them? How do you develop them? How do you coach them so that they can be able to lead and disciple people in your church? Succession planning is rooted in your leadership development, which is essential to the future and the health of your church. It's very, 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 very important. What is the detail about leadership? Leaders, okay, it's organic, it's on the bottom side of the fusion diagram, it's relational, it's task-oriented, it's contextual, also has a concept of timelessness. The leadership role of the apostle was very evident in the scriptures, and the complementary component is discipleship, okay, which is the top side of the visual diagram. Outreach is how you're going to use good deeds. It's different from evangelism, to show that you love the community, to show the love of God to the community. And leaders need to make sure that they're able to do community analysis to make sure that outreach is actually meeting the needs of the people in the community. Now, the breakdown of this is that it's organizational, is the bottom side of the visual diagram, it's relational, it's time-bound, it's contextual, because how you do outreach in America will be different from how you do outreach in South Africa, okay? Because there are two different cultures, two different kind of people, and then the way they show love, the way they meet needs are different, okay? The bottom side, the top side, which is the complementary component to outreach, is evangelism. I don't want to go into this, but I'm sure there's a difference between evangelism and outreach. Okay, there's a difference between evangelism and outreach. That's how I wanted to just explain that. One has to do with using the gospel, the other has to do with good deeds. All right. Onboarding, which is the same thing as assimilation, is how you go to get, how do you get in staff? How do you get in converts? How do you get in guests? Those three things come to the front door, and every church that needs to grow must be very concerned about how you bring staff on board, how you bring converts on board, how you bring guests on board. That's another training entirely in terms of effective assimilation systems. Okay, so Onboarding is organizational, is bottom side, is both relational and task-oriented, is time-bound, is contextual, because how you assimilate people in Asia will be different from how you assimilate or get people on board in America. So that's very, very contextual. The complementary component is ministry. The time is going fast. It's ministry. And then the other one is resources, which is the last one. And this has to do with your facility. It has to do with your asset, your liability, your infrastructure, office management, and things like that, technology, administrative systems. And the resources, what is the framework? Is the bottom side, is additional, is really more managerial, task-oriented, primary, time-bound, contextual, and then they were able to administer all the things they had in common in Act of the 2. And the complementary component is prayer. Now, there's one area that is very key to how we resolve these things. I told you that I have a tool of assessing the top side of the fishbone diagram, and also have a tool of assessing the bottom side of the fishbone diagram, and also a tool to check the 14 vital signs. And then once you are able to know where the church is unhealthy and you work on those weak areas, there's something that happens, the church begins to dive towards church health, and many things happen. So what I'm trying to say here is that strategy is one key area, and it happened in Acts chapter 6. They had a problem. They were in violation of true religion. There was a murmuring in the early church, despite God was blessing them with souls. There was an issue with the daily administration. People were neglected in daily administration. But you see, everything must start from strategy. You must sit down, count the costs, and then look at how you're going to address the issue. Sit down with strategy. How can we get worship, all these other 11 systems healthy, and then making sure that the church goes into church health. Now, the 7 things we need to learn from the early church is that they love sacrificially, both in deeds and in truth. They reached out to the lost passionately. They obeyed God, and they were united in such a way that they brought all they had together. Okay, that's the spirit of the early church that we need to emulate together. The 4th one is that they demonstrated the power of God regularly. It's not something that was occasionally. You will see that all through Acts of Apostles. Then the 5th one has to do with great importance of God's word. They place great emphasis on God's word. In Acts chapter 6, the apostles could not neglect the prayer and the ministry of the word because of the magnitude of problem that the widows brought about, because they were neglected from the daily ministration. 6th one has to be international, encouraging one another, and the 7th one, giving glory to God. And then I don't want to go into this. Here, just to tell us that there are certain things that a small church has that we need to reinforce and imbibe, even when the church is large. There are certain things that the large church has that a small church needs to look at and imbibe. I just want to go straight to questions right now so that we can wrap up this meeting in good time. Thank you very much for the attention.